Hello everyone, this is Megan again, and today's presentation is going to be called A Strange New Possibility, Metafiction, Historiography, and Identity in Middlesex. And the basic thrust of this project is really to expand on Deborah Shostak's article that we all read, in which she states Jeffrey Eugenides' Pulitzer Prize-winning comic epic Middlesex however, offers in its portrait of an intersexual protagonist a fascinating representation of the slippage that may occur between theory and what Eugenides terms practicality, in specific relation to the comprehension and construction of an identity, and hence a place in the world for the anomalous body. And on our discussion board, I actually think we had a little bit of dissension in whether or not Shostak perceives Eugenides as being successful. I personally think she's a little bit dismissive of what he does with the text, and I think she dismisses it for the same reasons that we'll see later Scott Cohen does as well, although he says that aesthetically the book fails, because both of them feel that there's a heteronormative conclusion sort of forced upon this story that closes out the possibilities that the theory suggests could bring cultural change. I would say in response to that, that it's the story itself that's intended to be the middle space rather than Cal's story arc. What happens to Cal isn't necessarily what closes out possibility in the text. Rather, the story encourages us to have a conversation about the lack of current narrative and linguistic discourses regarding those that fall outside neat categorization. So therefore, it's the text that should really be our focus, and the way that it talks and the way that it conveys these ideas, because it challenges our entrenched concepts regarding storytelling and who's the speaker. And on the discussion boards as well, I mentioned this phrase, historiographic metafiction. At first, I want to define metafiction using Patricia Woe's definition, in which she claims metafiction is fictional writing that self-consciously or systematically draws attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. In providing a critique of their own methods of construction, such writings also explore the possible fictionality of the world outside the literary fictional text. And that's very important, as we're going to see in a minute, in connection with Linda Hutchins' idea of historiographic metafiction. Just to give you a few examples of what metafictive devices include, that's typically whenever we have a novel that's about writing or reading, or within a novel we see the appearance of a text or a work of fiction within the narrative, and then we also see explicit references to narratological conventions, all of which figure prominently throughout Middlesex. We also have what Linda Hutchins calls in the Politics of Postmodernism historiographic metafiction. And these are textual elements that explicitly address the narrative aspects of history's construction. So we can turn perhaps to Hayden White there, in which he points out the fact that history is inevitably a narrative. We have to make rhetorical choices when we construct histories, which means that there is someone narrating the story of history with a specific purpose to a particular audience, and that then means that history is unknowable. That is always a construction. And therefore, when we have a novel talking about it, again, it's pointing to the disconnect between the way we tell stories and what happens in our experiences of life. And Linda Hutchins points out that metafiction has potential for political resistance, which I think fits very well with what Middlesex does, as well as gesturing back. It forces the reader by making us aware that the narrative is a construction. It forces us to consider the real world that is surrounding the text and what motivates the construction of that text. So before I jump into really historiographic metafiction. I just want to spend some time on metafiction in the text in general. And the book already preps us to be open to this idea of construction, of thinking reflectively upon the discourses that we ourselves are entrenched in by being an incredibly hybrid text. It pulls on several genres. The New York Observer described this text as a hybrid form, an epic crossed with history, romance, comedy, and tragedy. It's also described as a family saga because it covers 3 generations. Samuel Cohen defines it as a historical novel, although Eugenides rejects that description. And then Collado Rodriguez talks about it and describes it as Middlesex moves from being mostly a Greek American contemporary epic in books 1 and 2 to a modernist Bildungsroman, or a novel of experience, in book 3. However, this narrative genre gradually hybridizes into a beatnik story in book 4. I apologize for torturing that word, which comes to an end after some thrilling pages written in the mood of the detective genre. And why that's important is, as savvy readers, as postmodern readers, we are very open to the idea that a text can be both and. We know it can be a detective novel and a beatnik novel. It can be a Bildungsroman, it can be a romance, it can be a historical novel, it can be all these things. We accept the idea of hybridity in genre, which means that it then pulls on a practice we already have when it introduces the possibility of a figure who can be both male and female. The other thing this text does, from a metafictive point of view, is it pulls in from the very beginning this idea of multicultural narratives. It's Greek American, and so it starts with Greek literary conventions, and then throughout weaves in Greek folklore and myths. So, of course, in the beginning we have the "Sing now, O muse, of the recessive mutation on my 5th chromosome." Sorry if I get a little Homeric at times, that's genetic too. And so we see the beginning with the Greek invocation, which is then mixed with the scientific discourse of gene mutation. And then we see Cal acknowledging that he is a narrator who's using narrative conventions in an ironic fashion. We also have several references to Greek figures throughout. Cal is, of course, born as Calliope, who's a muse of heroic poetry. So we see these poetic conventions as the beginning, references to Homer, meaning this is, in a way, an epic story, not just Cal's story, but the story of an entire family. We also have references to Hermaphroditus, the Greek deity of bisexuality and effeminacy. And of course, then towards the end of the book, Cal performs as Hermaphroditus for people to view. And then throughout the text, there's this image of Cal as Tiresias, who's a blind Theban prophet, but who also lived as a woman for 7 years, interestingly enough, as a curse. So it's a curse to be a woman. But he both posits himself as this prophet and at other times rejects the idea that he can see everything. So his reliability as a narrator is sometimes called into question. But as I said, Cal himself is a hybrid figure. For instance, I've lived more than half my life as a male, and by now everything comes naturally. When Calliope surfaces, she does so like a childhood speech impediment. Suddenly there she is again, doing a hair flip or checking her nails. It's a little like being possessed. She rises up in me, rises up inside me, wearing my skin like a loose robe. Very interesting idea that this feminine figure haunts him. But Rodriguez says Callie literally embodies sex and gender middle ground. So this figure can speak to us from both sides of the experience, and therefore it's fitting that this hybrid genre text would come from this hybrid figure. And it's also fitting because it allows the narrator a great deal of omniscience. Again, I've pulled several quotes, and I won't read all of them to you here, but early on in the very first page, there's the connection to Tiresias, the idea that they can see into other people's minds and feelings. Um, there's metafictional asides throughout the text. For instance, of course, a narrator in my position, pre-fetal at the time, can't be entirely sure about any of this. Again, the idea that Cal is both all-knowing, and at times that knowing is troubled, it's not always certain. Um, and the idea that stories are born in our minds, and so the way we tell stories affects the way that our stories unfold. And of course, that also ties into this idea of sexing the text, that there are metaphors regarding metafiction throughout the text. So here's two very overt examples of that. He even analyzed my prose style to see if I wrote in a linear, masculine way or in a circular, feminine way. Or children learn to speak male or female the way they learn to speak English or French. And of course, we talked about on the boards, is this so? Do men and women actually write in identifiably different ways? So Cal kind of perpetuates that stereotype, interestingly enough, tying the idea that narrative can be feminine, and when it's described in feminine terms, it's womb-like or circular. So a few quotes. Despite my androgenized brain, there's an innate feminine circularity in the story I have to tell. I'm going to rewind the film. Like her, I unravel my story, retrace the filament, and you go back to the cocoon's beginning in a tiny knot, a first tentative loop. And here's where my story splits, divides, undergoes meiosis, when Cal is developing in his mother's womb. At the same time, narrative can be masculine, and when it's described in these terms, it's often compared to semen or ejaculate, and it's portrayed as linear. Quote, a billion sperms swim upstream, males in the lead. They carry a story too, a long white silken thread spinning itself out. But what's very interesting is that both the masculine and the feminine metaphors interweave, that it's either a cocoon spinning out thread or sperm in a thread, and they ravel and loop. What is a circle or a loop but a line that's simply turned on itself? So a narrative can be both feminine and masculine at the same time. So the way we speak about narrative can be intersexed without really us being consciously aware of it. And what's more important is that that both of these metaphors, this idea of it being either a womb or an ejaculate and being both of them, gives life, that they have the power to produce new life and new possibilities, that the way we speak about these new subjectivities becomes possible if we can accept that narrative is not inherently one or the other, but can be both. And those two pictures that I use for those metaphors are ink and water. So there's a little metafictive visual rhetoric for you. And then another thing that we see occur in this text are several intertextual moments. But I'm actually going to pause the presentation here because I only have a minute left, and I will leave you on this cliffhanger for the second video. So I hope to see you in a second.